Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. David Yeager. Dr. David Yeager is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and one of the world's leading researchers into mindsets, in particular growth mindset, which is a mindset that enables people of all ages to improve their abilities at essentially anything. He is also a world expert into the stress-is-performance enhancing mindset, which is a mindset that allows people to cognitively reframe stress, and that when combined with growth mindset can lead to dramatic improvements in performance in cognitive and physical endeavors. Dr. Yeager is also the author of an important and extremely useful new book entitled 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. The book is scheduled for release this summer, that is, the summer of 2024, and we provided a link to the book in the show note captions. During today's discussion, Dr. Yeager explains to us exactly what growth mindset is through the lens of the research into growth mindset, and he explains also how to apply growth mindset in our lives. He also shares the research from his and other laboratories on the stress can be performance enhancing mindset and how that can be combined with growth mindset to achieve the maximum results. So while I assume that most people have heard of growth mindset, today's discussion will allow you to really apply it in your life, not just from the perspective of you, the person trying to learn, but also for teachers and coaches. In fact, Dr. Yeager shares not just the optimal learning environments for us as individuals, but also between individuals and in the classroom, in families, in sports teams, and in groups of all sizes and kinds. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is AeroPress. AeroPress is like a French press, but a French press that always brews the perfect cup of coffee, meaning no bitterness and excellent taste. AeroPress achieves this because it uses a very short contact time between the hot water and the coffee. And that short contact time also means that you can brew an excellent cup of coffee very quickly. The whole thing takes only about 3 minutes. I started using an AeroPress over 10 years ago, and I learned about it from a guy named Alan Adler, who's a former Stanford engineer, who's also an inventor. He developed things like the aerobie frisbee. In any event, I'm a big fan of Adler inventions, and when I heard he developed a coffee maker, the AeroPress, I tried it, and I found that indeed it makes the best possible tasting cup of coffee. It's also extremely small and portable, so I started using it in the laboratory, when I travel on the road, and also at home. And I'm not alone in my love of the AeroPress coffee maker. With over 55,000 five-star reviews, AeroPress is the best reviewed coffee press in the world. If you'd like to try AeroPress, you can go to aeropress.com/Huberman to get 20% off. AeroPress currently ships in the USA, Canada, and to over 60 other countries around the world. Again, that's aeropress.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by ROKA. ROKA makes eyeglasses and sunglasses that are of the absolute highest quality. Now, I've spent a lifetime working on the biology of the visual system, and I can tell you that your visual system has to contend with an enormous number of different challenges in order for you to be able to see clearly. ROKA understands this and has developed their eyeglasses and sunglasses so that regardless of the conditions you're in, you always see with the utmost clarity. ROKA eyeglasses and sunglasses were initially designed for use in sport, in particular things like running and cycling. Now, as a consequence, ROKA frames are extremely lightweight, so much so that most of the time you don't even remember that they're on your face. They're also designed so that they don't slip off if you get sweaty. Now, even though they were initially designed for performance in sport, they now have many different frames and styles, all of which can be used in sport, but also when out to dinner, at work, essentially anytime and in any setting. If you'd like to try ROKA glasses, you can go to ROKA, that's ROKA.com, and enter the code Huberman to get 20% off. Again, that's ROKA.com and enter the code Huberman to get 20% off. And now for my discussion with Dr. David Yeager. Dr. David Yeager, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us your definition of growth mindset? I think most people have heard of it. They have some sense of what it is, but you've worked very intensely on growth mindset for a number of years. So I'd love to know how you define it.
Yeah, so it's simply the belief that your abilities or your potential in some domain can change. A huge confusion is people think it means if you try hard, then you can do anything. But that's not really the idea. It's simply that under the right conditions with the right support, change is possible. And, that ends up being a pretty powerful idea because the opposite is so stressful, right? The idea that you are static, nothing about you can change is really kind of a stressful idea.
Of all the studies on growth mindset, including yours, ones that you've participated in, what one or two kind of high-level results stand out to you as the most striking, surprising, exciting, or meaningful? And here I will encourage you to discard with attribution. We know that, or everyone should know that Carol Dweck is the originator of the growth mindset idea as a field, and she deserves tremendous credit for that. So, so when you stand back from the field, given that it's mushroomed into this very large field now, and you look at the research, which results kind of stand out as like, wow, that's really cool, really meaningful. People should know about that.
What stands out to me a lot, first of all, is just the field experiments. That the idea that you can distill a complex idea about the brain, about malleability, you can give it to a young person at a time when they're vulnerable, and that can give them hope, and then they can do better at school or whatever. So our 2019 paper in Nature that Carol, Greg Walton, Angela Duckworth, a lot of us collaborated on, took a very short growth mindset intervention, 2 sessions, about 25 minutes each for 9th graders. And we found kids were 8-9 months later more likely to get good grades. By 10th grade, more likely to be in the hard math classes. And the unpublished results find effects 4 years later on graduating high school with college-ready courses from a short intervention that happened, just 1 or 2 times, no reinforcement. So there's a lot of reasons why that's true. That sounds magical and outrageous, and there are a lot of mechanisms. But that just demonstrates the overall value of the phenomenon. And in that study, we did everything we possibly could to address legitimate skepticism, right? Are we collecting and processing the data in ways that could bias it? No, third party. Are we handpicking schools where you could get the best effects? No, random sample of schools. Did we post hoc decide on the analyses that would make the results look the greatest? No, pre-registered. So that's a good okay, this phenomenon is not something that falls apart in the hands of anyone else besides a select few researchers. That's really, and we can go into that. But that doesn't explain the mechanisms. And I think that there are a lot of interesting growth mindset mechanism studies. My personal favorite is a very underappreciated kind of like indie rock study by David Nussbaum and Carol Dweck that David did when he was a graduate student at Stanford. And it's on defensiveness versus remediation. And the basic idea is, in a fixed mindset, the idea that your intelligence cannot change, you are the way you are, it can't change. Your goal in that fixed mindset is to defend your ego, to hide your deficiencies or any flaws, because if they're fixed and then they're revealed, then it labels you for life in some way as less than, shameworthy, et cetera, right? In a growth mindset, though, a mistake is part of the process. It's just an opportunity to grow. So David took that idea and then set up a study, and I think I have the details right, where undergraduates did a task. They all did poorly. They were getting 20, 30% correct on this task. And the question is, what do you do before you do your second try? How do you cope with that initial failure? And he found that both fixed and mindset participants wanted to recover their self-esteem. So you do poorly, you feel like crap. What am I going to do to feel better about myself? In a fixed mindset, they looked downward. So the people getting a 25 look at the people who got a 12. And I'm twice as good as these losers, right? In a growth mindset, they look at the people getting an 85 or 90. What are they doing? What are their strategies? How can I improve? Both of them then recovered self-esteem and looked the same at post-test. And I think about that a lot. How often in our society does something happen to us and we feel like garbage and you have a choice? Am I going to look down on other people and say, at least I'm not as bad as these losers? Or am I going to say, how am I going to get better? And I love that, because think of a 9th grader who bombs their algebra test. am I like a no good, dumb at math loser who's not going anywhere in life? Well, at least I'm not that burnout, right? Or is it like, how is anyone getting an A in this class? I'm not getting an A. What's happening? What can I learn from them? So the openness and willingness to self-improve, I think, is the underwriting mechanism. And hardly anyone cites that study, but I think about it all the time. And it's the kind of thing that I like, if I'm being honest, that's the mindset I want my kids to have as they go through life.
Very interesting. I'm going to ask you more about this looking down or looking up in terms of performance. But before I do that, I have questions about these brief 25-minute, I think you said, interventions.
Yeah, sometimes 25. Sometimes we do 2 sessions, each about 20, 25. Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of what those interventions look like? I mean, it's incredible. These 2 sessions have positive effects lasting up to 4 years and perhaps even beyond.
Yeah.
Maybe just a top contour of some of what these kids hear during those sessions.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to realize is that they're short and they have to do 2 things in order to have long-lasting effects. One is I have to convince you to think differently at the end of the session. So I just have to persuade you over the course of 25 minutes to have a different mindset. That's sometimes hard. But then even if I do that, you then might have months or years between when I did that and when the outcome is measured. So how could you remember it and apply it? And how many 25-minute experiences in your life do you no recollection of, right? I have lots. So I think people are skeptical of the mindset style of interventions for 2 different, I think, legitimate reasons. Like I remember a very famous statistician came to my office at UT Austin and was like, I just don't understand these interventions. I mean, the other day I spent 25 minutes telling my son all the things he has to change and like how he's doing everything wrong. And he didn't remember it 5 minutes later. How could someone remember your thing 4 years later? And I was like, did you hear yourself talking? Like, I'm sure the way you talked to your son was like totally condescending and bad. So the first step is in that 25 minutes, how are you communicating in a way where someone's ears are open, where they're not feeling talked down to, ashamed, humiliated, et cetera. But then the second step is saying that to you at a time when it's possible for there to be what we call a recursive process or a snowball effect that's going to happen over time. So that's the stage setting. Okay, so now let's take the first part. 25 minutes, what am I going to say to you, right? There are 3 big things that are in every intervention. And the term that Greg Walton, the Stanford professor, colleague, collaborator, uses is wise interventions. That's the umbrella term, of which growth mindset is one. And a good one, but it's just one of many. For wise interventions, we often do the following 3 things. First is we present some new scientific information, some idea that almost in like a Gladwell way is not obvious and intuitive to the reader, but feels like new information and useful information. So the first is a scientific. The second is we present participants with stories from people like them who've used those ideas in their lives and found them useful. So in the concrete case of 9th graders getting growth mindset, it's like 10th, 11th, 12th graders who previously felt dumb, learned a growth mindset, then felt better. It's more complicated than that. That's the basic idea. And last, we don't just tell them the stories, we ask, third, for participants to author a story. So they write a narrative about a time when they struggled, a time when they doubted themselves, and then remembered this idea that people can change, like my brain can grow, et cetera. So the 3 points are like scientific information, stories, or the technical term is descriptive norms. So you're giving people information about what's normal for people like you. And then the third is the writing, which we call saying is believing, which is a term that's a popularized version of the term that came from classic social psychologists Josh Aronson, Elliot Aronson, who found in the work on cognitive dissonance 30, 40 years ago that one of the best ways to change someone's mind about something is to ask them to try to persuade somebody else. So that we do those sort of things. So what is the science in the growth mindset? That's where we draw on the metaphor that the brain is like a muscle. that just like muscles get stronger when they're challenged and can, recover, so too does the brain get smarter when it's pushed and challenged in a certain way.
This idea that writing a story about oneself or about others in which one succeeds can be useful toward building growth mindset in basic terms. I think that's what you're referring to. I think is interesting. It sort of suggests that we have brain circuits that underlie growth mindset type behaviors and thinking, and that just storing into those can potentially lead to better decision making and behavior. I mean, obviously, it can't create new skills simply because I can't write a story about me being able to dunk a basketball and then expect that I can dunk a basketball, because at present I can't. But the idea of writing a story about the effort going into dunking a basketball and learning how, and then translating that to a more realistic sense of ability that allows me to then go practice more. Is that sort of what you're referring to?
Yeah. So in a 2016 paper in PNAS, Greg Walton and I explained these types of interventions as we call them a lay theory intervention. And the idea there is that lay people, like not scientific theories, but just our intuitive theories for explaining the world, help us anticipate what something means. So the idea from basic developmental psychology is that human beings are walking around with kind of prior belief about objects, about motion, about number, and then later about complex social structures, like whether people are looking down on me, where I stand relative to others, and also little lay theories about adversity. What does it mean when I have to put in effort? What does it mean when I fail? So the idea is that if you understand the theory someone has, then you'll understand the meaning they'll make about a future experience. And therefore, and the reason meaning matters is because the way you interpret something then affects how you respond to it, right? So if I see someone and they're doing something innocuous, but I interpret it as a threat, do I call the police? Do I run away? That's my interpretation. That's causing it, right? And so there's a long way of saying, it turns out one of the best ways to preset someone's meaning and give them a different theory is to give them a different story. Stories are kind of like theories in motion. Mm-hmm. This is why, what's the point of War and Peace, right? War and Peace is really a theory of great leaders in the war. And if there's any English PhDs, I'm sure they'll tell me that's an oversimplified version of what Tolstoy was doing. But you learn the theory in a narrative way, right? So this is a classic idea throughout human history. Great writers and authors give us theories through narrative, right? And so we're just taking that simple human fact and doing it in a 10-minute activity. And the lay theory in a person's mind that when things are difficult, it can change, can be taught with a very simple narrative, which is this person or even I experienced difficulty on something that mattered to me. That difficulty didn't determine my entire future because actually there were steps that I could take in order to make a difference. Here are the steps that I took, and then it improved. So it's like the simplest Freytag's pyramid. And even though that simple story is available to all of us, you could look in culture and see it. You also see the opposite lay theory all the time. And so absent our intervention, it's not like people couldn't end up with a growth mindset, but they wouldn't kind of know what to sort for or what to look for. So we give them some touch points for very simple of frustration, things can change, then they got better. And we think that once people do that in our writing exercises, they're more likely to see that pattern out in the world. And if you see that enough, and then you take the actual steps to get better, then it starts becoming true for you. And that's what I call the recursive process, that we give people a starting hypothesis about the world. They go out, try things, struggle, fail, it improves. Then they see that that's true, and then they can keep acting on that over time.
I feel like so much of getting better at things involves reappraising the stress or anxiety response. The friction that one feels when they can't perform something well, or when things feel overwhelming or confusing. And I think the analogies to physical exercise apply, but I feel like they're limited in the sense that I like the idea that the brain is like a muscle, that it can grow and get stronger. I think the key difference to my mind is that, like working out with weights, you get some sense of the result you're going to get because there's like a lot of blood flow into the muscles. So it's like a hint of what's possible.
Right.
With cardiovascular exercise, like if we run hard up a hill, there's that moment where your lungs are burning, et cetera. And anyone who understands exercise knows that that's the signal for adaptation, such that the next time you can do the same thing without the burning of the lungs.
Right.
When it comes to mental work and learning, I think we immediately assume that if we're not performing well, if we're getting confused or overwhelmed, that somehow we're doing it wrong, as opposed to stimulating the growth.
Right.
And so are there any studies that point to bridging the relationship between the physiology, the stress response, and the mindset that allows one to say, okay, this is really hard and I keep failing and failing and failing at this math, at this language learning, at writing this essay, whatever it is. And that's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. It's like the burning of the lungs, or it's like the failure to complete another repetition in the gym.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. The standard growth mindset message does have reappraisal components, specifically around something Carol Dweck has called effort beliefs, which is very simply the belief that if it's hard, it means you're doing the wrong thing. And that follows naturally from the fixed mindset idea that ability can't change. And I think it's very important to point out the centrality of that effort belief, because people have tried to apply growth mindset but simplified it in a way of just saying, basically try harder, right? Or I believe in you. If you try hard enough, you can do anything, right? But if your natural inclination is to view the need for effort as a sign that you are doing the wrong thing, that's the default interpretation, then people are going to quit, right? If you believe effort outs you as lacking potential, and then I say you need to try hard, I'm saying you don't have potential. That basic insight is very poorly misunderstood in the field, and it's led to tons of misapplications of Carol's work. And then people are like, well, this thing doesn't work. Well, okay, but you haven't addressed the effort belief. So I think that the first type of response to what you've said is you can't just abstractly tell someone your brain is a muscle and assume that magically, then in the midst of stress and frustration and confusion and all those negative experiences, that you're going to immediately say, yes, I love doing this and this is great. But then there's also the physiological component, as you're saying. So when we're stressed, frustrated, confused, your heart starts racing. Maybe your palms get sweaty, right? Your breathing, starts getting heavier. My daughter, who's 13, before like a cello audition, it's like, I have butterflies in my stomach. I don't, what does this mean? And I think that growth mindset research didn't always deal with the visceral experience of stress and frustration. And I think in a world in which someone hears the growth mindset message and says, yes, now I'm going to go challenge myself. I'm going to embrace stress and frustration, do the mental equivalent of, running ladders or running up a hill. Then they feel that stress, but if they don't know how to interpret that, it's like growth mindset isn't going to get them to the skill development, right? Or at least to the mental well-being of feeling like they have confidence and can do well. So, in some research that we've done in the last few years, what we've tried to do is to marry together the growth mindset idea with great work originally coming out of Ali Crum and Jeremy Jameson's labs, who were building on lots of great appraisal psychologists, Wendy Mendez and others, to say, okay, in the inevitable experience where if you fully believe our growth mindset and then now you load your plate with challenges, but now you've got a physiological stress response, how are you going to appraise that better? And that's kind of been the new frontier of growth mindset work in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, could you tell us more about this stress-is-enhancing mindset? I think it's a really interesting one, especially when it's woven in with the growth mindset.
Yeah. So let me tell you kind of that on its own, and then the story of how we had this insight is actually kind of interesting too. But just the basic idea, as people who've heard about Ali Crum would know, and Jeremy Jameson, is that an experience of your heart racing, your palms sweating, anxiety in your stomach, that is itself a new stressor that then needs to be interpreted and appraised by the person experiencing it. Mm-hmm. That idea on its own is kind of revolutionary for people. People tend to think that your physiological arousal is this objective experience that is universally bad. Ali Crum calls that a stress-is-debilitating belief. And I think that's a good label for it. It's this idea that heart racing, palms sweaty, butterflies in your stomach is a sign of your impending failure and doom, and it will always interfere with your performance. And the implication, therefore, is if you were about to do well on whatever you're going to do, then you wouldn't feel that way, right? Ali Crum calls us being stressed about being stressed. And that, I think it's a really common experience right now where people are like, wow, if I was a confident, good person who was about to do well, I wouldn't be sitting here feeling so stressed about how stressed I am. And it becomes this metacognitive layered loop of just being stuck in your own mind and interpreting your arousal in the most negative possible light. So that stress-is-debilitating belief people aren't like wrong for having come to that belief because it's everywhere in our culture. One thing I do in my class a lot is I just have people Google image search stress management memes. And first of all, a surprising number about cats. I don't know why people think cat pictures are like the way to convey complex scientific ideas. Like it'll be like a cat with like a cookie jar and it'll be like growth mindset. I don't understand what the point of that is. But page 2 or 3 after all the cats, then you get to a lot of things you'll see a person with a battery that's empty and it's like they didn't de-stress, or 10 tips for de-stressing. And it'll be like, go on a walk, drink chamomile tea. And the underlying implication is that if you're stressed, then you need to distract yourself. You need to get rid of that stress. But an alternative explanation in the growth mindset world is, well, maybe you have something that's very important to you and you've pushed yourself to embrace some challenge in a really admirable way. And that has filled your plate in some way. If I was about to give a presentation to a senior vice president at work and I'm stressed about it, I should not go take a bubble bath and go for a walk. I should get ready to kick ass at the presentation, And so I think what Ali Crum and others have identified is that you can think differently about that stress. You can say, this is actually a sign that I'm preparing to optimize my performance. And maybe the heart racing isn't my body being afraid of damage. Maybe it's my body getting more oxygenated blood to my brain and my muscles to help me do really well. And that's called a stress can be enhancing belief. And what's so interesting, I think, about this work, and I want to give credit to lots of other people, is that if you're in the stress-is-debilitating mindset, you don't realize that there's an alternative. You just think that that's the way it is. So it never occurs to you to say, oh, this stress is helping me, right? But once you tell people this, what happens is, in our studies, we actually see a change in stress physiology. Changing your mindset about stress, in turn, changes how your body reacts, which then becomes a different stressor that you can interpret. And so the big insight was pairing these ideas about reframing stress as an inevitable force that's going to destroy your goal pursuit into a resource to be cultivated, and pairing that together with the first step, which is the growth mindset that causes you to be open to the challenge in the first place.
I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge our sponsor, AG1. By now, most of you have heard me tell my story about how I've been taking AG1 once or twice a day, every day since 2012. And indeed, that's true. I started taking AG1 and I still take AG1 once or twice a day because it gives me vitamins and minerals that I might not be getting enough of from whole foods that I eat, as well as adaptogens and micronutrients. And those adaptogens and micronutrients are really critical because even though I strive to eat most of my foods from unprocessed or minimally processed whole foods, it's often hard to do so, especially when I'm traveling and especially when I'm busy. So by drinking a packet of AG1 in the morning and oftentimes also again in the afternoon or evening, I'm ensuring that I'm getting everything I need. I'm covering all of my foundational nutritional needs. And I, like so many other people that take AG1 regularly, just report feeling better. And that shouldn't be surprising because it supports gut health. And of course, gut health supports immune system health and brain health. And it's supporting a ton of different cellular and organ processes that all interact with one another. So while certain supplements are really directed towards one specific outcome, like sleeping better or being more alert, AG1 really is foundational nutritional support. It's really designed to support all of the systems of your brain and body that relate to mental health and physical health. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. They'll give you 5 free travel packs with your order, plus a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman. I feel like so much of what human beings struggle with, such as learning and performance, our relationship to stress, etc., could be resolved if we could overcome the deficit in language. Here's what I'm thinking. We're talking about reframing stress to make it performance enhancing as opposed to performance diminishing. I wonder if we replace the word stress with just like levels of arousal. But then people hear arousal and they think certain kinds of arousal. So what we want to do is, the way I think about it is like a continuum of readiness. But then that doesn't work because readiness could be readiness for sleep, which is a low level of arousal. You don't want to be highly alert, and then you're not ready for sleep, right?
Yeah.
So there's a real deficit of language where I think if there was some other word, I can't come up with it on the fly, where, one's internal level of readiness as opposed to stress, and maybe it looks a lot like autonomic arousal where heart rate is increased and blood pressure is increased, and people would say, oh yeah, that's my body being ready for something as opposed to stressed about doing it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a trivial, recasting of stress on the one hand, but in terms of, kids learning about life and stress and arousal and these internal signals and adults learning about those and incorporating those into their life goals, I think it would be pretty meaningful. And I don't have a solution to this, but I feel like everyone hears stress is bad. You hear stress is enhancing. Okay, great. But I think it's really about developing a language that lets us interpret what's going on in our bodies and compare that to what we are facing in the moment and just decide, is this well matched or poorly matched to what we need to do? Is it great for going to sleep? Is it great for learning? Is it great for catching that train that's soon to leave the station? And I just wonder why the deficit in language?
Yeah, I think it's a profound question because small changes in language perpetuate problematic lay theories because they have the baggage on them. And I think that, let's think this through. So what the psychophysiologists like to point out is that there's a distinction between the stressor, which is let's call it the internally or externally imposed demand. It could be something that's thwarting your goals or
the exam, the difficult conversation,
right.
For some people going to the doctor or the dentist,
the hard conversation with somebody you care about. It could be or a physical stressor, right? Like a football game or running a marathon, right? So anything that imposes demands on your body and mind, and therefore will require resources, whether metabolic resources to do well. That's a stressor. Okay. Then there's your appraisal of it. That's what you name it, how you interpret it, how you frame it in your mind. And then there's your response. People in general conflate the stressor with the stress response. When they say stress, they're like, I'm really stressed right now. Well, what you mean is that there were stressors, you appraised them as more than you can handle, and then you had a threat type stress response, which means that your body is preparing for damage and defeat. And that is like an inheritance of how the sympathetic nervous system evolved, which was to keep us alive from threats, mainly physical threats. And so if you have a stressor, some demand, praise is something you cannot handle, and then your threat type response, your body's basically assuming you're going to lose whatever physical fight you're in, like the bear's going to, tear you apart. And then your main goal at that point is to stay alive and like bleed out more slowly, right? Mm-hmm. So you end up with more blood kept centrally in the body cavity, less in the extremities, right? The body releases cortisol because it's an anti-inflammatory. It's going to like help with tissue repair 45 minutes down the road. So there's a whole like cascade of physiological responses that come in part from the mental appraisal that this stressor is more than you can handle. Now, we're very rarely confronted with those kinds of physical stressors these days. It's often social stressors. But a lot of these social stressors are the threat of social death, right? Like a ninth grader coming into high school, getting bullied by all their friends and are excluded because their friends in eighth grade now treat you like you don't exist, right? The threat of social death is pretty bad, right? Or you're a new legal associate and you've filed your first brief and all the partners are like, this is garbage. We're not going to send it to the client, right? Like all of a sudden you're on trial socially in front of these people who could cut you loose at any time. That's a very vibrant social stressor that evokes the same kind of physiological response as we suppose a physical one would, right? And so we're very careful to distinguish in our studies a stressor from the stress response because often the stressor isn't really a bad thing. Like, getting critical feedback on your first legal brief as a junior associate, well, that could be awesome. It could be like, oh, great, I have these awesome partners at my great law firm are now giving me personalized feedback. That's useful. Or I'm a ninth grader and I have to make new friends, but I don't know, that's maybe you need new friends. Like that could be a good thing, right? And same with a test, same with, presentation to senior vice president, whatever it is. Stressor is often in our daily lives are not good or bad. Now, of course, there's traumatic stressors that, are really bad for people. But then the appraisal is really where there's a lot of leverage. And if you think that the stressor is inevitably bad and that your response to it is always harmful, then it's really hard for you to think that you have the resources to meet the demand that you're facing. And you end up in this threat cycle. So in a lot of our research, what we try to do is give people a different story to tell themselves about a stressor and about their response. So that way they end up in a better place. Now, I don't know what that better language is, but I will say I once gave a talk at a middle school and a high school, and I used slides that Jeremy Jameson, who's my collaborator, had sent me that had the word arousal on it on every single slide. And that was a big mistake in a room of like middle school kids. So
right.
I'd strongly recommend different terminology. I was a middle school teacher. I should have known that you can't say that word in a high school. So.
Right. Yeah. I think that there needs to be a better language. I think if people of all ages understood the autonomic nervous system, this aspect of our nervous system that is on a continuum that leads us to either be, I guess at the extremes you would say, coma would be the deepest state of parasympathetic, non-arousal, then ascending from, very, deeply asleep, lightly asleep, groggy, awake, awake and alert, awake and alert to the point of being, highly alert. And then you get into kind of low-level panic and then all-out panic attack, right? I mean, that's kind of the continuum, the autonomic continuum. I feel like if people understood that and they could simply ask, okay, where's my body and mind along that continuum, and then compare it to whatever it is they face, then we'd have a better sense of whether or not we were in the correct, maybe even optimal state for dealing with challenge, or not. And along those lines, what is the optimal internal state for dealing with challenge that is just outside our ability? Maybe in an exam where I can naturally get 85% of the answers correct, but maybe 15%. I think this is what the machine learning and AI tells us is probably the appropriate level of difficulty for something in order to best learn. I know that's probably too broad.
It depends on if you're motivated and if a lot of things but yeah, I mean, I think if you think of the autonomic arousal on just one axis, where you start running into problems we find is that I think you're right that there's like, coma to like some arousal or meaningful arousal, but it's the middle to the end part where there's two different tracks. And one track is very high arousal, but you're terrified of the damage and defeat and the humiliation and the failure. And so that's demanding all your attention. That's what we call a threat type stress. There's another version that is, again, very high arousal, but that's like you're stoked and you feel confident you're going to do well. And that's also very high arousal. And if you just look at arousal measures like pre-ejection period, right?
Could you explain pre-ejection period?
It's a simple measure of just the sympathetic nervous system that we use in all of our studies.
So sympathetic, just to remind folks, is one aspect of the autonomic nervous system. Has nothing to do with sympathy. Just the more alert means more contribution of the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system. Sorry, it's a mouthful. And then less alert would be more contribution of the parasympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system.
And PEP is just a measure that we use in our laboratory studies. And another could have been like skin conductance, which is about the sweat coming out of your skin, and then we use an electrode to figure out how much is there. Those kinds of measures can't distinguish what we call a challenge type state. That's almost like people have heard of flow, where you're optimally balanced between important challenge you care about and resources and ability to, overcome or at least deal with that challenge. On the positive side, in the other high arousal state, which is threat, and that's, again, everything's highly engaged, your whole stress system, but you don't think you can deal with it. So that becomes really important because here's just a very practical example. If you look at devices people are wearing to detect their stress, that might say high or low arousal, but it can't distinguish between super good, positive challenge type stress and really negative threat type stress. One of the examples that psychophysiologists like to say a lot, I got this from Jeremy Jameson, is imagine you're at the top of a double black diamond about to ski down. Mm-hmm. If you are a good skier, your heart rate isn't probably low. You're probably amped up. You're stoked. You're like, this is awesome. I can't wait to do this. You're fully confident. You're going to make all the turns and have a blast. If you're a terrible skier, you're just imagining the yard sale that's about to happen. You're about to crash. You're going to fall down the mountain. You might die. Also high arousal. If you're wearing like the regular watch that will just detect sympathetic nervous system activation, it wouldn't be able to tell the difference between really stoked to do something positive and terrified of like crashing and dying. And so I like that example because often in social situations or performance situations, you want to be high arousal to perform your best, but you want your perception of that demand, the demand that's requiring your body to respond, to be matched with an equal belief or what we call appraisal of your resources to meet that demand. So I think my answer to the question is well, I think it's not so much about what's the optimal amount of demand, right? So the 85% likelihood of success rate problems that's titrating demand. Mm-hmm. I think it's how do you pair a necessary level of demand for whatever goal you have with the perceptions of the resources. And sometimes those resources are your internal, like just confidence, or sometimes it's your ability to reappraise, and other times it's material resources. Like, do you have it could be in real life, do you have a friend that you could turn to? Or it might be, have you been trained in a way where you're able to overcome this? Do you have enough time? So resources can be a big bucket. And that's kind of the magic, is because resources are appraised by the mind, in our interventions, we can give you a different way of viewing your resources. So that way people feel like they can meet the demand, and that pushes them from a threat type response into a more challenge type response.
It makes sense. If I think that the stress, for lack of a better term, and the effort is going to get me where I need to go eventually, I'm going to be far more willing to invest the effort.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm motivated. I want the thing that lies at the finish line.
You basically take the demand, which was your intense stress and worry, and turn it into a resource in your own mind. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that actually helps people cope at a physiological level.
Got it. We've been talking a lot about kind of the nuts and bolts of growth mindset, and stress is performance enhancing mindset. Maybe we could shift a little bit to the discussion about what you call the mentor mindset. And as we do that, maybe we'll weave back in some of these concepts.
Yeah.
Your book, 10 to 25, focuses heavily on social appraisal, self-appraisal, basically the idea that we want to be liked and we don't want to be disliked. And it hurts when people say mean things about us or when we hear negative feedback, especially if it's provided publicly. But ultimately, what we do with that information is what determines, whether or not we grow and move forward.
Yeah.
Everyone loves a great report card. Nobody likes a poor report card. So tell us about mentor mindset, and both for folks in the 10 to 25 age range, but also for everybody, because it's clear that this impacts us throughout our lifespan.
Yeah. So the work I write about comes out of a dissertation led by Jeff Cohen at Stanford in the 90s with Claude Steele. Mm-hmm. And they coined a term that they called the mentor's dilemma. And the mentor's dilemma is the idea that if you're a leader, a manager, a coach, teacher, whatever it is, parent, it's very hard to simultaneously criticize somebody's work and motivate them to overcome and embrace that criticism. And the reason it's a dilemma is because the leader, on the one hand, wants to maintain high standards by being critical, maybe in order to help the person grow, but that could crush the person's motivation. The alternative is withhold your criticism. Don't say the truth. Hide all the critical feedback and be nice and super supportive. And that meets your goal of being friendly and caring, but it doesn't help the person grow. So it feels like we have to walk through the world stuck between two bad choices. Either you're a demanding, autocratic, dictator who doesn't care about human feelings, or you are a low standards wimp pushover that's giving in to the wimpy demands of the weak next generation. And neither of those have uniformly positive connotations. Mm-hmm. And the classic example in Jeff's work was a student at Stanford who writes a first draft of an essay and then gets really harsh critical feedback from a professor. Are they willing to revise their work? Or do they say, this teacher hates me, they're biased, I dislike them, and leave the comments unaddressed? So the solution to that in that research on the mentor's dilemma has been to say two things. One is appeal to the very high standard you have for someone's work, but also always accompany that appeal to the high standard with an assurance that if they implement the feedback and use the support, that they're capable of meeting the high standard. I like to think of it as if you go to the roller coaster and they say you have to be this tall to ride, right? So just saying you have to be this tall and you're not, see you later, isn't reassuring to somebody, right? But if you can say, here's the standard and I believe you can meet it, but it's going to be hard, that means a lot. It means I'm taking you seriously. It means I believe in your growth. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of leadership practice that makes growth mindset be something that comes to life and feel true. It's not just an idea in your head that you're growing. It's I live in a social world where people are going to push me to grow and not leave me alone.
Are you familiar with the book of the late, I think the pronunciation is Randy Pausch, for the last lecture?
No.
He was a computer scientist. He developed a lot of early online portals for kids, in particular young women, to learn programming. Mm-hmm. I think it was called Alice. Mm-hmm. And he is known for what's called the last lecture. He was diagnosed with cancer. He eventually passed away. But he talked about, in his book, lessons that were important for life. And one of the things that he said was the thing to worry about is not when your mentors and coaches are pushing you. It's when they stop pushing you that you should really worry, because that means they've basically given up on you. Right. So that always rung in my mind.
Yeah. What I call the person who just is no longer maintaining high standards for you, I call that a protector mindset. That it's almost like it's going to be too much trouble to see you dealing with stress from being pushed, that I am going to protect you from that stress. Maybe I care about you, but I'm not gonna hold you to a high standard. And I see that a lot in coaches. I see it in teachers. I see it in parents. For me, the opposite problematic version is what I call an enforcer mindset. This is like, here's the standard, and I'm going to hold you to it, and it's up to you to meet it or not, right? That's kind of like the college professor that says, look to your left, look to your right, half of you, are going to be gone by the end of this. For me, the solution is to think about taking the best parts of both of those two. What's the high standards, high support? So enforcer, great, you've got the standards. Let's add your support. Protector, you care a lot. Great, let's add the standards. And what Jeff Cohen and Claude Steele found in their initial study is that students were far more likely to view negative criticism as a sign that the teacher cared for them if it was accompanied by a transparent and clear communication of these two elements of high standards and high support. If it was just the critical feedback, the professor could have meant the same positive thing, I'm caring about you, but they didn't make it clear to the person, then participants were less likely to think that the professor was on their side. And in our work, in some small studies, we showed that even seventh graders, when they get critical feedback on their essays, are about twice as likely to implement the teacher's critical feedback with even a very short invocation of the high standards and the high support. So to get to your question about mentor mindset, at some point, I got worried that our experiment on high standards, high support messages, which we called wise feedback in those studies, would be viewed as, like a magic phrase. My joke, my laugh line, this is a lame laugh line, but I'm a professor, so that's the best I can do. My laugh line was always, I just live in fear that Pearson and other textbook companies are going to sell wise feedback Post-it notes and say they can magically erase the achievement gap, right? And I always said that as a joke, and then two things happened. One is a popular author, a guy named Dan Coyle, literally called it magic feedback in his book. Didn't cite us, but
You didn't say us?
No.
Dan.
But also magic feedback.
I'll say it so you don't have to. Not cool. Attribution is important.
It's just not, it's not magic at all. Mm-hmm. The magic of high standards and high support is not the 18 words. It's, I'm taking you seriously in a moment when you're vulnerable and I have power over you. That is just so deeply human and so powerful. But there's nothing about the magic words. It's the experience of dignity and respect when you are questioning whether you're either worthy of it or are going to be given it by authorities.
It's interesting. We had Dr. Becky Kennedy on here to talk about parenting. And, and she said many important things, but among them was the fact that children, perhaps all people, want to feel real. Yeah. And they want to feel safe. Yeah. An important concept that I think many people heard and are really internalizing. I know I am for sure. And this idea of feeling real has to do with not just feeling seen, but that people believe us, even if they disagree with us. Yeah. Like they believe us.
She has another thing that's super profound is the kind of two things argument, that I can both have high expectations for my kids and love my kids. And I think that's a very good version of wise feedback mentor mindset, that as parents, it either feels like I can expect a lot of my kids, but then I'm a monster and they're going to yell at me, or I'm going to be a pushover and then they're going to be unruly. And I think part of her wisdom is to help explain to parents how you can do both of those things.
And indeed one can, right? I think, but it requires having a kind of dynamic stance or dynamic mindset as the teacher, the leader, the coach, the parent. I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Waking Up. Waking Up is a meditation app that offers hundreds of guided meditations, mindfulness trainings, yoga nidra sessions, and more. I started meditating over 3 decades ago, and what I found in the ensuing years is that sometimes it was very easy for me to do my daily meditation practice. I was just really diligent. But then as things would get more stressful, which of course is exactly when I should have been meditating more, my meditation practice would fall off. With Waking Up, they make it very easy to find and consistently use a given meditation practice. It has very convenient reminders, and they come in different durations. So even if you just have 1 minute or 5 minutes to meditate, you can still get your meditation in, which research shows is still highly beneficial. In addition to the many different meditations on the Waking Up app, they also have Yoga Nidra sessions, which are a form of non-sleep deep rest that I personally find is extremely valuable for restoring mental and physical vigor. I tend to do a Yoga Nidra lasting anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes at least once a day. And if I ever wake up in the middle of the night and I need to fall back asleep, I also find Yoga Nidra to be extremely useful. If you'd like to try the Waking Up app, you can go to wakingup.com/Huberman to try a free 30-day trial. Again, that's wakingup.com/Huberman. I want to get back to some of the mechanics of how to go about that, but why do you think this stuff is so hard? Like if we think about, I don't know, kind of a curbside evolutionary theory, meaning I don't have any formal training in evolutionary psychology. You could step back and say, like, I don't know, maybe we just used to be so busy from morning to sleep that we didn't really have time to do anything except the stuff we needed to complete in order to feed our families and take care of our communities, et cetera. And now a number of things are outsourced. And so here we have this notion of strivings. But then again, we went from hunter-gatherer cultures to writing War and Peace and everything else, right. Technologies of all kinds. So, there must be something in the human brain that causes us to strive. And what we're really talking about here is striving and our relationship with striving. So if we were to step back and just say, okay, what do you think determines whether or not someone feels they can do better? Is it early success? They tried at something. I mean, most everyone, I assume, who tries to learn to walk, walks, learns to speak, speaks. There are rare exceptions. But, what do you think this whole thing about strivings is about? And when we talk about growth mindset, stress-is-enhancing mindset, the mentor mindset, are we trying to get back to activating systems that are hardwired within us and that have been kind of masked by daily life? Or are we trying to kind of better ourselves and our species through, really trying to do something that's never been done in human history before?
Right.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. Yeah. But I think that all I can do is conjecture, as a scientist. But I'm often reminded of something I heard from Ron Dahl, who's a neuroscientist at Berkeley.
Not Ronald Dahl, the children's
book
author.
Not Roald Dahl.
Not
Ron Dahl. Although Ron is just such an awesome guy. It's just polymath who can do everything and just so curious and generous. What he always says to me is look, it's David, what do you think the human brain wants to do? I don't know, feel good. He's like, no, it wants to feel better. And I think what he was trying to get me to see is that it's the kind of pursuit of some kind of delta. And
a change.
Yeah, a change from the state. And I think the argument is that even if what you thought was your biggest need, if that was satisfied, then there's always another thing, I think, is part of the argument. And so, but it's also this idea that if you think of the human brain as trying to learn at all times, what is it trying to learn? And at least in the animal studies, as often it's how do I either feel better or avoid, feeling worse in a lot of ways. And I think that as I think about adolescence, that's a period where your theory of how to feel better is dramatically changing because you're no longer fully cared for by adults, right? All of a sudden, your criteria for feeling good about yourself is your social standing, not just in your parents' eyes, but in the eyes of the community and the milieu you're a part of. And that comes a lot from your contribution value. If you think in our evolutionary history, being ostracized and alone is certain death in ancient human cultures, right? The tribe's wandering around in the savannah, you're alone. At a minimum, you have no one to watch out for you when you fall asleep. And so, humans can't sleep in trees because our muscles don't contract when we're asleep, unlike animals. And so you're just exposed on the ground. If you're alone, eventually you're going to die, right? So the fear of moving from parents taking care of your safety all night to now you have to trust peers to take care of you and watch over you, that comes to the forefront of young people's minds, the minute puberty strikes. And so what it means to feel better often is that I'm socially valued by the group. There's something, they're going to keep me around for some reason. Now, they don't often keep score in an explicit way. I mean, now things are in social media, maybe they're kind of keeping score, but like the rules of how you're doing socially are so implicit. You have to read between the lines. They're inferred. Social hierarchy is very complex for adolescents. And so they overdo it thinking through like how am I standing? Like where am I relative to others? Now that process is started by puberty, and we know from lots of species work that it then leads to changes in the brain. So the dopaminergic system, of course, is like driven in part by changes in gonadal maturation. Ron likes to talk about these great studies of songbirds, of how do they learn the mating calls. And if songbirds don't have testosterone when they are learning the mating calls, they don't do the like over-the-top obsessive practice, so they don't master them, and then they don't mate and they die alone.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah.
With that literature, there's a great, unfortunately now passed away, biologist who was first in the UK and then was up at UC Davis, Peter Marler, and who studied the birdsong learning.
Yeah.
And it's
amazing work.
Yeah, it's amazing work, and it mimics a lot of the development of human speech, although not exactly. Like there's this babbling phase, where babies and birds experiment with different tones, and they're learning to use the pharynx and larynx, or in birds it's a slightly different system.
Yeah.
And some birds are seasonal singers, but I wasn't familiar with this result that the testosterone drives a kind of obsessive practice.
Yeah, it's obsessive practice in order to demonstrate status, but really your value. I mean, there it's mate value, right? But I think the same thing is true for lots of things that teenagers try. It could be playing guitar, could be gymnastics. I mean, think about how many of their Olympic athletes are like 14, right? And they're waking up at 4 a.m. They're practicing obsessively. How many like pro-social hackers who take down evil foreign governments, right, are teenagers, right? They're things that take so much practice and so much learning happen at the exact same age as adults are saying these kids are lazy and don't want to work, right? So I tend to focus on, let's get to your question about why do people strive to get better. I think in adolescence, you look around in your social milieu and see what counts for status, not in a superficial way, that sometimes happen, but often in a deeply meaningful way. What am I going to bring to the table?
One would hope.
And then, well,
I remember junior high school being far more superficial, but I'm 48, so I remember it in the kind of the John Hughes film era where people were very divided in terms of jocks and skateboarders and rockers and nerds. Now it seems a little bit more mishmashed. But I think also people will, in adolescence, I feel like kids find their niche and then try and excel within that niche.
Yeah.
As opposed to high school or junior high school being one huge hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's kind of these sub-hierarchies.
Yeah, Dan McFarland is a sociologist at Stanford, did this really interesting study with the ad health data. And turns out you could characterize the social hierarchies in different high schools by kind of single pyramid high schools versus multi-pyramid high schools. And there's way better adjustment in the multi-pyramid high schools because there's many routes to status. The evolutionary psychologist Bruce Ellis talks about having many roles. And I like that because in the old model, if there's one pyramid and you're kind of near the top but not at the top, you've got a lot of incentive to destroy reputations, be mean girls type of behavior. Bob Ferris, a sociologist at Davis, finds that the most bullying in high school is the people that are like the 60th, the 85th percentile on popularity. It's like you're near the top but not all the way at the top.
Yeah, this maps very well to Robert Sapolsky's work on primate troops.
Yeah.
Yeah, the alphas are stressed, but the sub-alphas they have options.
Yeah.
And this is true for female and male animals. Just as it's true, we were talking about testosterone a few minutes ago in obsessive practice. I'll remind people that in women, they actually have adult women have more testosterone than they do estrogen if you look at a pure nanogram per deciliter comparison. It's just that overall it tends to be on average less than in men. So the statement about testosterone and obsessive learning or efforts to learn, I have to imagine is not restricted to males or females.
Yeah, and I think I understand as a man praising testosterone that I could come across, but I always need to remember that the research is very interesting on T. Eveline Krohn's lab did these great studies where they had kids starting age 10 to like 25 and they had them come in the lab twice, and they took testosterone levels, but also had them do a bunch of tasks in the scanner. And you can look at nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, et cetera.
Areas associated with reward.
Yeah.
And pursuit, motivation.
Yeah. And they also had them do risk-taking tasks. And what they find is that in both boys and girls, testosterone goes up over time. Starts a little earlier in girls because gonadotrophy is 1 or 2 years before boys. But the change score from one point to the next was equally predictive of neural reactivity during risk-taking tasks for both boys and girls. So although boys end up with higher T throughout adolescence, the increase is equally predictive, which is another way of saying it's just as important for these social learning things in girls. And T, by the way, is just a really
testosterone.
Good testosterone's a really good proxy. Other hormones are involved too. They're just more complicated. Like DHEA, you could study as well, but that's part of the same metabolic pathway of cortisol and testosterone, so it's just messier and harder to interpret. So we're not making claims specifically about testosterone. It's just like a really good proxy for where you are in gonadal maturation. In both boys and girls, gonadal maturation really matters for this kind of status, social seeking part of your brain.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the slope of the line of one's testosterone increase for both boys and girls is predictive of striving. If it's a steep upward, line, that's associated with more striving in a given practice.
To the extent that neural activation during a social reward task or a risk-taking task is a proxy for striving, and that's what a lot of people have argued. Yeah.
Do you think that striving reflects the action of a kind of a basic neural circuit that then can be applied to other things, or lots of different things? The reason I ask is that the notion of growth mindset is so attractive. It's such a sticky idea because one imagines, okay, if I can get really good at one thing, chess, then I can apply the same kind of relationship to the internal state of stress or arousal or what have you when trying to navigate a new environment of another kind, a physical practice or a relationship challenge or something of that sort. That what we're really talking about here is an algorithm that can be directed at different pursuits, as opposed to growth mindset is applied in one context and not another. So what of that? People who are incredibly good at accessing growth mindset in one domain of life, does that mean that they'll be good at accessing growth mindset in another domain of life? What's the carryover or the spillover?
It's a great question. It comes up a lot. The Michigan State psychologist Jason Mosier studied this, and they measured growth mindset about your intelligence, the classic one, your personality, your morality, your social relationships, your emotions, et cetera. And the question is there kind of like one growth mindset that applies in all the different ways, or are there totally narrow mindsets that have nothing to do with each other, or is it something in between? And the finding was that there is an overall association. If you think one trait can change and be developed, you tend to think another trait can be changed and developed. And just empirically, it's hard to separate that from people's general tendency to disagree or agree with items. That could be what the common factor is, but it kind of makes sense. However, there's also very domain-specific mindsets. So there are people who think, yeah, I can get smarter, but I can't change my shyness. And other people who think, my relationships are never going to get better, but I can learn to play the cello, and vice versa. And when you want to predict behavior, turns out that the closer you are to that domain, the better the prediction is going to be. So if I want to know if you're going to quit playing the cello or not, I'm going to ask you your cello mindset. That's going to do way better than, in general, can human qualities change? But if I'm going to intervene, at what levels should the intervention happen? If I only change your cello mindset, well, you're right. Like, what if cello isn't your thing in life? Now are you going to be fixed mindset for your relationships in school, and did I not really help you? So the kind of the empirical answer currently is if it's a domain that someone could be really defensive about, it's better to be a little vaguer about it. Classic example is Eran Halperin's work on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is obviously a big issue right now. Their science paper in 2011 changed mindsets about group conflict in general. Can an ethnic group or a national group ever change? They didn't go to people in Israel and say Palestinians can change, because they're like, no, they can't. It's not possible. But if they said, sometimes leaders change, and then when leaders change, the group's priorities change, and they become more amenable to negotiation. And when that happens, things can change. If that was done at a more general level, then both Israelis and Palestinians were more open to a peace process. So I think if it's something you're very defensive about, I tend to think back up and do the more abstract mindset. Another example is, I remember I was in graduate school at Stanford, and one of my RAs was so excited about our work, and he went to a party and talked about it. It's like that, very Stanford thing to do, is talk about research at a party. And he's like, oh yeah, math ability can change. You don't have to be dumb at math forever. And the person he talked to was so offended. She was like, are you telling me I could have done better in high school math and I just didn't try hard enough? And my life could be different. I could be an engineer right now. Like, I like my life. Why are you telling? It went down this road of, like, how dare you tell me it could have been different? And who knows, maybe he had bad delivery and had 14 margaritas, and who knows what happened. But I think the idea is, like, if someone's got a reason to think about that fixed mindset as comforting in some way, that they don't have to feel bad about something that could have been different, it's probably not smart to go after that in a very specific way. But if someone's not defensive, generally the closer to the domain, the better, because they're going to see the application. Otherwise, they have to use it by analogy. And we know analogic reasoning is tough because it's hit or miss.
We love stories of people that have come from a place of being really back on their heels, or even just dissolved into a puddle of their own tears too. Doing well again, maybe even soaring again. It's sort of the common thing is that this is the classic American story, although it's true of people all over the world, I imagine.
It's not always true in America either, but yeah.
Right. Some people
we love
rise.
The story.
Yeah, some people crash and burn, but it seems like everybody loves a comeback story.
Right.
I don't know, something about that.
Yeah.
The hero's journey, the hero of 1,000 faces, is that the Joseph Campbell?
Yeah.
And it's written into so many movies and books and real life stories. I can't help but superimpose today's discussion onto something like that, right? That that life is a series of efforts to apply growth mindset, from learning how to walk, right? So presumably is part of that, right? I don't know any child that just stands up and walks early on, to the things that we really think we can perform well at, to finding ourselves like really back on our heels. And so are there any data or theories even that point to the use of growth mindset and stresses enhancing mindset in coming from a real place of deficit? No, not just from trying to do better and learn new things, but from a real place of deficit, a real place of challenge. I think it's important for our audience to hear, because I think a number of people do feel back on their heels in one or more domains of life.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the data suggests that growth mindset becomes most relevant to your next behavior the more challenge you face. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, what that meant is, if you maybe were a low achieving student, and we're gonna evaluate growth mindset by looking at your grades, you should see bigger gains for low achieving students compared to high achieving students. Mm-hmm. Part of that could be an artifact. If you already have straight A's, we can't give you more A's. It's impossible, right? But in general, psychological treatments like a growth mindset tend to work better for people who counterfactually wouldn't have them and could plausibly benefit from them. Where the story becomes more interesting is that often your kind of own individual difficulties are associated with your environment. And the environment is really what allows you to apply your growth mindset over time. So it might make you right now need a growth mindset more, but it might make it harder for you to act on it. And so for people who like complex three-way interactions, the idea is that a treatment for growth mindset should work best for individuals who face the most challenges but are in the most supportive environments. And one is like baseline, why do you need it? And the other is over time, what's going to help you keep using it? So to be very concrete about this, In one paper we published in 2019, the National Study of Learning Mindsets, it was published in Nature, we evaluated growth mindset in this large national sample. And the question wasn't, does it work on average? The question was, where does it work and for whom? Because there were lots of replications already, and sometimes people tried it and like, well, it didn't work here. Okay, well, that's a puzzle. How do we figure that out? And the finding was low achieving students in high schools that had a more supportive classroom culture, where you got the long run effects. And in the 4-year results, it's low achieving students in high schools that offered more advanced courses. So if you're a low achieving student, Yeager with mindset, it's like, great, give me pre-calculus. Oh, we don't offer that here, right? Or it's a toxic environment in some way. Their teachers are untrained, they're first-year teachers. There's lots of poverty in the school. If you don't have the structure to support the striving, you don't get the long-run effects, especially if the effects you're looking at are increases in equality of opportunity. So for me, the message is, like, you think about growth mindset and psychological interventions as one tool in a toolkit to help people achieve their goals. But we can't forget about the entire field of sociology that tells us a lot about the allocation of resources through which people can even be afforded the chance to pursue their goals. And so what I like about that finding, which by the way came from a collaboration with sociologists who thought, you psychologists are absurd. They're like, you think your little mindset is gonna like change inequality? Like, you're gonna make an argument to 15-year-olds and that's your plan for improving the American economy. That's absurd. I was like, well, I don't know, you could do something. And psychologists are skeptical of sociologists. They're like, look, how often do we have huge changes in law and policy, but people don't take advantage of the resources that are available to them? Let's change the behavior so they take advantage. We kind of came together and said, what does it look like to consider both the structure and the internal psychology? And I think this was a very important point because people tend to choose one or the other. Either we're going to lobby for new laws to reallocate resources, or we're going to optimize the psychology of the individual. And I think our perspective is to find ways to bring those two together and kind of do both. And ultimately, it's not a deficit-based perspective of you have a deficit and we're fixing that. Growth mindset's more like, well, it's an asset-based perspective. But what I mean by that is we're not giving someone motivation in growth mindset. We're presuming people already kind of want to do well. They want to impress others. They want to be meaningful. They want to contribute. But there's a barrier. The barrier is when you strive and then inevitably struggle, if you're pushing yourself beyond your abilities, people make you feel dumb for that struggle. So we're trying to remove that cultural and social barrier that's preventing people from their natural goal pursuit. And that comes deeply from Carol Dweck's original work at the intersection of developmental and social psychology. The basic claim in developmental psychology is the human being is an active learner who's trying to figure out the world. Right? This is classic Alison Gopnik, Susan Gelman. Infants are meaning makers trying to interpret the world and wanting to do well. And eventually they're socialized into beliefs that prevent them from acting on that basic neural desire to learn, grow, develop, et cetera. And growth mindset is really, it's not trying to be a magic pill to give an unmotivated, disaffected kid a shot in the arm of adrenaline so they go out and learn. No, it presumes agency and love of learning and kind of, like Dr. Becky said, presumes the goodness in kids and tries to remove whatever kind of garbage beliefs they've learned from social contexts. And then our long-term studies then show how once you do that, if you're also in a context where you can act on that love of learning, then you can see long-run effects that are far more than what a lot of people have said you could get even in a disadvantaged context.
It's so interesting because what we're talking about here is psychological theory playing out in the real world, but also kind of like deep notions of the human spirit. Like we are a species that seems to organize our experience in terms of stories of ourselves and others, but that when it comes to things like strivings and learning, are really always in a constant state of either being more, to borrow the words of a friend of mine, either back on our heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass, right? And what we're talking about today is being forward center of mass, at least in certain areas of life. I mean, the fact that the reward systems of the brain, you mentioned them earlier, these mesolimbic reward pathways that basically deploy dopamine and other things, of course, are so associated with striving and achieving, and presumably underlie much, if not all, of our human evolution, assuming we're still evolving. Lately, sometimes I wonder, but some people would argue we're devolving, but I would argue we're still evolving, especially with this new burst in AI. It's all about math nowadays, folks. A few years ago, it was all about neuroscience, and neuroscience is still really important, and the two share, but it's all about math lately. So I like to just think of the human animal as so different than the other animals of the planet. Like, we're the curators of the planet. The house cats might be striving, but they're clearly not doing as well as we are in terms of managing the way the world goes. So what do you think that this is like a basic algorithm within human beings to look at ourselves, look at the environment, see challenges, overcome challenges, develop technologies? It's just kind of like it's like the same way my bulldog used to like to gnaw on things. You know, you like to chew and pull. We just want to learn and grow. Do you think it's inherent to who we are as a species, maybe even what sets our species apart from all the others?
I mean, that's a profound question. I think that's a good one to debate. What I've been really taken by recently is Carol Dweck's secret life as a neuroscientist. She has this great psych review paper that contradicts a lot of received wisdom about the prefrontal planning regions of the brain and the kind of amygdala and the hippocampus, the affective regions and the memory creation regions. And the classic argument, and going back to Plato and the Phaedrus, right, is that the rational acting part of the brain plans out what it wants, makes all these calculations, and then has to tame the emotional part in order to make those goals into a reality. And so the emotion, the amygdala, the mesolimbic, that's this unruly horse that the charioteer has to harness, And I think that Carol argued, and I think other people have argued too, I've seen Adriana Galvan and Rondal and others argue this, that the affective regions are often the teacher and the prefrontal is the student. And that makes sense if you think about how humans are goal-directed. Think about how a kid learns to walk. They don't do that for theoretical reasons. They don't just like look at people walking and be like, I want to learn how to do that.
Right.
I have 4 kids. It's usually because there's a toy at the other side of the room that they really, really want and that I don't want them to have. And the only way for them to go get it, because I won't get it for them, is for them to learn how to walk. So the motor learning is the effect of the desire in the goal pursuit. And what Carol argued is that Phaedrus had is totally wrong. It's not that the prefrontal charioteer is taming the emotional. It's really that the affective part is training the prefrontal to be better at pursuing the goals that matter in the social milieu that you have. And a lot of people like Adriana Galvan and Jen Pfeiffer and Nim Tottenham in the adolescent space have shown this, and I don't understand all the details fully, but the argument that I've heard is that once the scanning studies were able to switch from fMRI focused on simple activation to studies looking at connectivity, then where you could get temporal ordering, then you could start seeing actually that, especially in adolescence, it's the affective regions are training or teaching or telling the prefrontal regions what to do. So I guess that's a long way of answering the question of, I think goal pursuit is fundamental to human nature. And I think that the brain and our adaptation is designed to help us learn how to be a lot better at pursuing whatever goals will help us survive in our environment. And the brain has to be adaptive to that environmental input because the environment's always changing. If it had only one way of pursuing its goals, then we would never survive. So it has to be the case that the planning, rational, observing part of the brain is actually responsive to what works in your context for goal pursuit. So again, I'm summarizing other people's work here, but that's how I see it. Yeah.
I completely agree that emotions drive the more, let's call it tactical circuitry of the prefrontal cortex. Of course, we should be fair to the neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex is part of the limbic system. People often think because it's in the cortex, it's higher order, and that's simply not true. But, well, if we both agree, and it sounds like we do, that emotions drive tactical decisions that drive action and learning, maybe we could talk about the two major types of emotions that one could imagine. One is, I really want the toy. I really want the piece of food. I really need something for survival or for well-being, and so I'm going to be motivated, and then the prefrontal cortex will work out the strategies and balance out the relationship to stress, et cetera, and remind ourselves that stress can be performance enhancing, and eventually we get the thing or the skill or the whatever. The other would be fear of social shame, fear of staying in a place that's not good for us financially, emotionally, socially, et cetera. Is there any work that identifies whether or not the core emotion driving motivation is relevant, and is there a role for growth mindset there?
That's interesting.
I guess put simply, take it down out of the ivory tower a little bit, which is what we're doing here anyway. You can do things out of love. You can do things out of fear. You do it for both reasons too.
Yeah.
You do things to please yourself. You can do things to please others. You can do things to avoid others being disappointed in you, you being disappointed in yourself. And presumably it's both.
Yeah.
But is there any, I'm dying for you to tell me that when we do things out of love, we learn faster, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, I don't know. I mean, so two thoughts. One is just, honoring Danny Kahneman, who just passed away. His work with Amos Tversky took on a version of this question in prospect theory. And it's the idea of does the fear of a loss motivate us more than the prospect of a gain, right? And their argument is that both can be motivating as well as the possibility of a loss, but that losses loom larger, that people are more willing to take a risky gamble to prevent a loss than they are to get a numerically equal, like a mathematically equal gain. And so a lot of people have used that information in various ways. And I think that has led people to conclude that the prospect of a gain doesn't mean anything. But that really wasn't ever the point in prospect theory. It's just that it's a little more powerful to avoid, to be afraid of a loss. I don't see a problem with thinking like, yeah, losses are a little worse. If I already had $1,000 and you took it away, feels a little worse than the chance to win 1,000 and I didn't win. Mathematically, it's the same delta. But I think that the way that behavioral economic work gets applied is to appeal to people's kind of basest and most, fearful responses to things. And if you think about what drives a lot of excellence in moral exemplars too, it's this chance to feel like you've made a big contribution to others. And I don't think people are afraid that they didn't help as many people as they could have. And maybe that drives some people, but I think just the affective forecasting of one day I'll feel good because of the meaningful work I did for others that was high integrity when no one else would have seen it. I think that's really motivating for a lot of people. And I think we underappreciate that, and therefore we appeal to very narrow self-interest. And my favorite theorist on this is Dale Miller, is at the Stanford Business School, and he calls it the norm of self-interest. That if you look around, it looks like everyone's behaving for only very narrow, short-term self-interested reasons. And because you think that's the norm, then you yourself kind of respond to those incentives, and then you in turn create that norm even more that other people see. But it's not a state of affairs that anybody really likes. Everybody kinds of prefers a pro-social world where people are helping others. But if you think that's just a really weird thing to do and not normal, then people conform to the wrong norm. So in my work, what I try to emphasize is not that we're not afraid of losses and the narrow short-term gain that we're avoiding, or the short-term loss we're avoiding, but like I really do think that people are capable of far more like beautiful contributions to the world when we assume that that's what they want and we create opportunities for them to do that. I've seen that so much. If you look at some of the best managers, right? It's not just if you screw up, you're going to lose your bonus. Like that's not what the best managers in the world are doing, right? They're like, let's do something no one's ever done before. Let me support you to do it. And then let me make sure that you look awesome in front of all the senior vice presidents because you did that. Like that's what the best managers do. And coaches too. For my book, I interviewed the NBA's best shooting coach. This basketball player named Shane Battier, who played college and pro basketball, told me about him. And I interviewed Chip England is his name. And he was at the San Antonio Spurs, which they had a 17-year run of being a perennial contender for the NBA championships and constantly drafted players who were talented but had a bad jump shot. So Kawhi Leonard is an example, where it fell late in the first round because people thought couldn't shoot. Tony Parker is another example. When Tony Parker used to shoot, Greg Popovich would say, that's a turnover every time. Chip England is a great shooting coach, worked with them. There's lots of, Bill Barnwell had a great story about him, called him the shot doctor. And I interviewed Chip and I was like, Chip, how do you sell the vision to these players who are 18 to 21, are newfound millionaires? Everyone's saying you're the best, you're a first rounder, and they don't want to change their shot because if they do, they could mess it up, make it worse. It's like a golfer who's superstitious about their shot. And he's like, the number one thing I have to do is build trust because I can't critique a player's shot and make them change it if they think they're going to sacrifice more. So he's like, Dave, the first thing you have to do is sell your vision. I was like, well, what's your vision? He's like, he doesn't say, if you don't change your shot, you are going to lose millions of dollars and be out of the league. So he doesn't motivate with the fear of loss. He says, the average time in the league is 2.5 years, right? If you develop a great, reliable jump shot where even as your athletic talents decline, you're still reliable, you're talking about a 10-year career. And then you're not just helping you, you're not just helping your family, you're helping your family's family. So even in the money-obsessed cutthroat world of professional sports, the single best coach working with the top players appeals to the prospect of what you could do for others, not the fear of loss. And to me, that's really telling. Like if it worked to just motivate with the fear of loss, then that's what he would do because they would do whatever's effective. It's at some level an efficient market. But that's not what Chip England does. And I think the same is true for a lot of other great mentors and leaders.
So if I understand correctly, when we find ourselves back on our heels or flat-footed, we want to focus on the prospect of what we can do for others. Like ultimately, that's going to be the best.
Or the world, yeah.
Or the world, yeah. I guess, yeah, pick your scope of impact.
Could be for art, for intellectual history. It's a classic Viktor Frankl argument of man's search for meaning, right? As Viktor Frankl is leaving the concentration camps, what helps him survive? And it's the debt that he owes to the future work that he wants to write to share with the world. And it's not the fear of death. It's the meaning of the work he could do for the world if he survives.
Yeah, I think I'd like to hover on this for a minute or two because I think it's really important. I realize we're getting more philosophical than operational, but
we have data on this. It's
I'd love to hear it. That's one of the things I'm really enjoying about this conversation. The moment I think it's going to be abstract or that you've got it all there in that brain. Let's talk about this. That when we feel back on our heels or we're flat-footed, meaning we're not doing well, maybe hard things have happened, focusing on the prospect of what we can do for others, not just trying to avoid loss or further shame or just diminishment is going to be the best thing. So what are the data on this?
Yeah, so first, just look at correlational studies in these global surveys of happiness. In almost anyone you can think of, the best predictor of life satisfaction and well-being is going to be the meaning of your life, in particular, the feeling like you're connected to others, you've contributed to others.
That your life mattered.
That your life, there was something of value in your life to others or to the world, right? And And so just anecdotally, the advice I always give to people like going through depression or the risk of that is to focus on what you can do for others or what you have done, right? So that's just correlationally. Now, experimentally, what we did in some work, this was started with my first advisor at Stanford, Bill Damon, who studies purpose in life, is we asked the question of when you're going through something tedious, boring, frustrating, what motivates you to keep going? And there are many possible answers to that, but we compared two different ones. One is the potential benefit you get out of that striving. So for a student in school, it's like the money you would get one day from working hard and doing well. An alternative, though, is what you could do with the knowledge that you gained by going through the hard learning. How could you contribute to others, make a difference, et cetera, with the knowledge and skills? We call that our purpose condition. A couple of things make that different from the standard narrative, but I think ultimately intuitive. One is the standard narrative is if you try hard in school or at work or whatever it is and suffer now, then one day there will be a kind of financial compensation. So you're suffering now in a way that will bring material reward in the future. The brain's not really designed to make that kind of calculation, right? It's like, well, how certain is the reward in the future? How far into the future? And how bad is the punishment right now? So there's all kinds of affective trade-offs that are hard for anyone, or especially hard for 13-year-olds, right? So what a lot of school comes down to is an adult saying, you need to suffer through 40 minutes per day of factoring trinomials because I said so, and I said it's good for your long-term future so that one day in your 30s you can barely afford a mortgage, right? This is not a compelling argument for most of America's youth, in my opinion. The purpose condition, though, is not about the exchange value of a credential a long time in the future. It's more like right now, you're getting a hard and kind of admirable skill that not everyone's going to get. And you're going to then be prepared when the moment arises to do something of significance for others. Now, that also is uncertain and in the future. But for things that are contributions, you kind of get to feel like a good person right now. The analogy I often use is if I'm going to like make lunch for the homeless, I don't have to wait until they actually eat the food to feel like a good person. I feel like a good person when I'm putting it in the bag, or even when I'm driving to the homeless shelter, right? And I think our idea was you can move up the reward by making it a social reward right now rather than a material reward years into the future.
Because then the pursuit itself becomes the reward.
Right now, and actually the more frustrating it is right now, the more I'm being a good person because it means it was a hard skill to acquire that'll prepare me to make a difference later. And so we framed super tedious math. This is with Angela Duckworth and Sidney DeMello and Dave Panescu and others, as Marlon Henderson, as a chance to gain a skill that helps you contribute versus a chance to learn how to get an A and make money in the future versus a control. And what we found was that the contribute to others version led to deeper learning, greater persistence, higher grades over time. And in one of our experiments, we gave them a choice of either doing super boring math or goofing off on the internet. And we were secretly tracking what websites they were going to. And we found that teenagers did more very boring math and watched fewer videos and played less Tetris when they were given this purpose message before the task. It's in our 2014 paper. And what I always think about, that's the kind of paper I wanted to go to graduate school to work on. But I think about it because if you think about Dale Miller's norm of self-interest, nobody thinks to do the purpose argument. They're like, of course teenagers are short-sighted and think about material rewards and all they want to do is either look cool or make money or whatever. But no, like in our studies, if you appealed to the chance to make a contribution right now, then they did the behaviors that adults want them to do. They didn't goof off online and instead chose boring math. And adults think the only way you could ever get that is by imposing our will and was this kind of authoritarian set of rules. But if you instead just appeal to the love of learning for the sake of others, then they're willing to kind of go through the suffering. And in the paper, we cite Viktor Frankl, where, the person who knows the why for their existence is able to bear any how. And I think about that a lot, that we underestimate how willing young people are, really anyone is, to bear through things that are hard and difficult if they have a strong why.
I think this is one of the most important concepts, frankly, ever discussed on this podcast, if I'm really honest. I think that, we've parsed dopamine circuits, and we've talked about motivation and reward. We've talked a little bit about growth mindset in a solo episode, but never before have I really understood the why component, the meaning component. And I love how it marries so much of what we hear in kind of like, pop culture, psychology with real data. Like we're finally, thanks to you being here, meaning we're finally in the guts of it. Because we hear this like, oh, it feels so good to make a contribution. But, people are also self-interested.
Yeah.
People want money. Then people say, well, past a certain amount of money, you don't get any happier. And I would argue that it's true, money can't buy happiness, but it can definitely buffer stress.
Yeah.
Not all forms of stress. And money itself can get people into more stress. But anyone that says, past blank number of dollars, there's no incremental increase in happiness, I just don't see how that could be given inflation. And
that treats humans like linear functions.
Right.
I think that's a simplification.
Right. If higher purpose is best defined as making a meaningful contribution to the world, to a community, or maybe at the scale of the world, maybe at the scale of a family or what have you, a classroom. And the thing that you said before that seems so important is that the moment that you attach your goal to something that's for others, it makes the effort involved its own form of reward.
Yeah.
That to me is so important.
Yeah.
So important. And I kind of want to highlight, bold, underline, and put a big exclamation mark after it, because that's so different than like, oh, I want to be the top player on the team.
Yeah.
Which means that every bit of effort you put in, you're like thinking, I'm gonna be the best. I'm gonna be the best. I'm gonna be the best. But and one perhaps can then feel that progress when one is making it, and feel like they're ascending that staircase. But something additional must come about when we're invoking this feeling of contribution. And I think this is central to our evolution as a species, because we didn't develop in isolation.
Yeah, we had to show our value to the group, or else they would get rid of us, right? That's what it meant to go from being a child to being an adult. And think about let's take basketball or whatever, right? If I'm trying super, super hard and it feels impossible to me and I'm not getting better, and it's purely for me, then I feel like a failure. It feels like my goals are not being met, and they never will be met, right? The effort feels terrible because it means something really bad about me, right? Now imagine you're putting in effort for others. The harder it is, the more awesome it is, because it's more noble, right? You've done something that's super impressive and sacrificed your own happiness for others, right? The social status of trying hard and failing for yourself is net negative, because it's about shame, humiliation, I'm not good enough. The status of trying hard and failing and keeping going for others is like super net positive, right? And I think that's what people fail to appreciate is, especially someone young or even just early in a career, right, starting out, if you can reframe difficulty and failure as part of the process of doing something with high integrity for others, like it changes the meaning of effort totally. And once you have a different meaning, then something that previously felt bad can instead be motivating, whether it's the stress, like in our stress enhancing work, or the boredom you're undergoing, it's doing something super tedious, or anything like that. I remember when I was at Stanford as a graduate student, I worked in the lab of John Krosnick, who is, famously detail-oriented. Whenever we want to go in really deep into something and go beyond what any other scientist would do, our joke name for that is giving it the full Krosnick, and he's in communications, political science, and there was one project I was supervising where, this will sound ridiculous, but it was, what is the best adjective to use in a survey item. So say you want to go like, how hungry are you? Not at all, very, extremely. Like what adjectives should you pick to label those in a survey item? And so the task was to find every time that human beings have rated adjectives on a 0 to 100 scale in the history of science, and then average across all those to choose optimally spaced adjectives like not at all, a lot, little. So we had a lab full of undergraduates at Stanford who are used to creating startups and running nonprofits, and this is very tedious work for them. So how do you get them to super pay attention to all the details and not get it wrong, where we really going to trust their work? It's not by saying, you're going to get into law school if you do this, because it's not really true. And they'd be like, there's a lot of other ways for me to get into law school that don't involve going to journals from the 1920s to rate adjectives, right? Instead, what I started doing was give them what I called the Save the World speech, which is like, look, we're going to write this paper, and it's going to be the kind of paper that no one would have done because it's so tedious. But if it's trustworthy, thousands of people would know how to have more accurate measurement. And they're going to be so grateful for that. But not only that, there will be skeptics. And the skeptics are going to look in our supplement, they're going to find mistakes, and then they're going to email the editor, and they're going to say, why did you let this sloppy work into the journal? And that happens all the time. I mean, I don't know how much you follow what's happening in behavioral scientists these days, but if you have an influential finding, that's the norm, is people should scrutinize it. They should kick the tires, and they're going to find it, and they're going to, out you.
And they're doing more of that now, like with PubPeer.
Yeah.
Which I think is great. PubPeer is awesome. PubPeer, folks, is where papers are evaluated online. People find sometimes outright errors. And sure, there are those like sleuthing for
you find fraud.
For fraud, but most of what's put there is stuff like differences in interpretation, or somebody will suggest that the authors could have done a better analysis, or that maybe their conclusions were a little too far-reaching based on a particular set of methods.
And I think it's good
something.
for science. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of bad-intentioned sleuthing that is trying to find circumstantial evidence to make someone look bad.
Is that true?
But yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a shame, because the whole purpose of it is to better the work, not to I'm assuming the whole purpose of PubPeer is to better the work, and of course point out where there are real errors in the historical literature.
Right. Well, I think that there's a new way to become famous in science, which is to find errors, which again is really valuable if you successfully do it. But there's enough room for interpretation that someone can, with circumstantial evidence only, make it look like something's really bad and then cause an alarm, and it causes all kinds of problems. However, that for me, at least in our lab, that if you always assume that someone will look at your work with the worst possible intentions, mm-hmm. and will ask for every file, how did it get from Qualtrics into your paper? Just assume that all the time. Then that means you need to pay as much attention to the file that was downloaded and how it was processed, and every part of the pipeline has to be documented. You just have to do that. And so that, working with Krosnick's lab, that's the process that we adopted. And there's all kinds of people email, they're like, wait, show me this finding. Like, okay, here's the link to the server, here's the syntax, you can go find it, et cetera, et cetera. So good scientists should do that. And so the possibility of scrutiny and catching fraud should motivate everyone to treat it as though it's an inevitability, and therefore, be careful in your process. Convincing 19-year-old Stanford undergraduates that is likely to happen, and that therefore you need to pay super close attention to the details, that was my task as a lab manager. And so there, it was a mix of the fear of shame and humiliation, but also ideally the contribution that our work will make. And we had the hardest working RAs we've ever had that summer. And that's not an empirical claim. That's, I say that, I didn't randomize the undergrads to that. But that experience kind of gave me the idea for the purpose studies, was, assume people want to do good work, but all else equal, they might find an easier way to do it. And then motivate with an appeal to how this work could make a difference, how other people could be influenced by it. And also, if you don't take it seriously, it'd be a really big deal. It'd be really bad. And I think about that a lot, because we don't often appeal to the contribution value of the work. We appeal to this, getting a good grade and impressing people. And that's less important for me than did I get a skill and did I do high quality, high integrity work.
So what you're basically saying is that if we attach our motivation to the give, to the contribution that we're going to make, it actually makes the process much easier, or at least more rewarding along the way, as well as, by definition, contributing more positively to society. It's causing me to reflect on what we normally perceive as like high-achieving individuals. So often it seems like we hear the stories of like the Steve Jobses, and I really enjoyed that book by Walter Isaacson and that story. I'm very, impressed by his contributions, although he's a complicated person, as is often the case with people that make big contributions, it seems, or people in the political sphere or people in the academic sphere or the sports sphere. Most often we think of them as striving for themselves, maybe for themselves and their family. And then there are these people that really stand out as these shining examples of like Martin Luther King or, and others where we just are kind of in awe of how mission-driven they were for the greater good. What sort of work is being done to encourage that kind of mindset, the contribution mindset, growth mindset through contribution mindset? Yeah. I just coined that, contribution mindset.
That's more words in there.
Right, exactly. That's all it needs, more mindsets.
Yeah.
But the contribution mindset, because I think, at least in this country, we are often raised to revere people that make big contributions, but then we get really absorbed into that person's story.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the story of the person and what made them tick, and then there's a lot of ego in it, or they have a kind of obsessive nature to them. And we don't know what goes on in other people's minds. We're so, I must say, there's a certain arrogance in all of our perceptions of others, like that we know why they're doing what they're doing. Like,
right.
Half the time we don't even know why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
But I think you get the idea here. What I'm imagining is a more benevolent world where people also enjoy striving more, and the striving process itself, while hard, has meaning, and people are not egoless, but where there's a bit more balance. Like, are we getting a little bit like we, kind of looking at this through rose-colored glasses? Or I think it's possible. I like to think it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the version that in which people are purely pro-social and self-transcendent and have no self-interest, is not super realistic. And that's not actually what our data are finding. So what we find is that adding this pro-social contribution argument has a big effect. But if you do it absent any plausible benefit the person would get, it tends to not be motivating. Mm-hmm. So it's the combination of, let's just take the school case. I'm going to learn something, gain a new skill. I'm going to get a job that I enjoy and that gives me freedom, and make a contribution to others. We found it was the addition of the pro-social part to the self-interested part. Mm-hmm. Now, if it was do X, Y, Z and make lots of money far in the future and then give that money away, that didn't work, because that's still the same logic of sacrifice now for later financial reward, which then has an exchange value of some ambiguous amount in the future. That one didn't motivate kids or students to want to deeply learn now.
That. Universities depend heavily on philanthropy, especially nowadays, and we're grateful to them that they support so much good work. So you're saying that there, it makes sense that there needs to be some component of self-interest, right? Yeah. Like Jobs loved design, right? Presumably folks like Elon and others love the mechanics of what they do, building rockets, building electric cars and things like that. But then this pro-social thing, the idea that the world could be better and different with these things in them.
Yeah, if you did the work right. I mean, a good example is my friend Danielle Craddock, who ran Empathy Lab at Google for a while, and before that worked at Apple and other places. You could think that designing products at a large tech company is purely about, is that product going to sell a lot, make a lot of money, et cetera? And that's obviously part of the value for the shareholders and so on. But her philosophy was always, okay, well, what's going to happen with the user? What does the user need? Is their life going to be better with this product? And that often led to design choices that made the product even better and more profitable. And I think there are a lot of examples of that where, when the team is trying to create something that is high quality but with integrity and ethics that are going to benefit people, people are willing to put in extra hours. They're willing to solve a puzzle, do better work. I think there are a lot of examples of that. That's on the product design side. I also want to talk about the management side. So one of the people I followed for my book is a manager at a company. She was at Microsoft. Now she's at a place called ServiceNow. And I just studied how she mentored young employees. Her name is Steph Akamoto. And she has this great story about a really awesome 25-ish employee, 25-year-old-ish employee showed up and had come from Teach for America, and now is in HR at Microsoft. And Steph could immediately tell, her name is Saloni, she's going to be bored by her regular job. She's going to be able to do more than what she had to do. But as a manager, you can't say as the first thing, you need to do twice your job for the same amount of pay. That's like not a good management philosophy. So instead it was a conversation. All right, what's a contribution you want to make to the company where in making that above and beyond, you're going to learn a new skill that's going to help you move up the ladder, right? So that in your next performance review, you're going to look like a superstar, like a total overperformer. And so at the time they were running global manager development. And so what they decided was don't just deliver the programs well, which Steph thought she could do well, but also create a dashboard to track everyone's progress. So every new hire they would know where they are in the management process. And it was global during the pandemic, so kind of a complicated time. Anyway, she did her regular job really well and created this whole dashboard, which brought value to the company, big contribution. But then when it came time for performance evaluations, she could say, like, you're already performing at a level 2 levels up. That gave her promotional velocity. She moved up. She left the company for a while. Now is the chief of staff HR at Microsoft, right? Kind of in line to lead Microsoft. And then what about Steph? Well, Steph's team overperformed, which was incentivized. But then she gets to go home saying, like, I use my time as a manager to change someone's life. And that brings her so much joy. And it's just so much fun, as a teacher, to have some of our time with young people lead them on a path they wouldn't have been on otherwise. It is a total blast to mentor someone and change their lives. So I think that's a good example of it's in everyone's long-term self-interest to contribute to both the company and the people around you. But no one's being a martyr. They're not, really, like, it's also everyone's compensated. So you need to think about, of course, is the company going to pay you if you help others improve? And there's important questions that we ask there. But I just think that's a good example where we have a false dichotomy of it's either good for me or I'm a martyr helping others. But like the best work is both. And then it feels awesome because you both change people's lives and you are compensated for it. And that's great.
Certainly has been my experience that doing things that I love, like learning and organizing and distributing information with the specific intention of people benefiting from it, should they choose to use it or apply it or think about it, is the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Certainly. Let's talk about this other phenotype. The people that, and they do serve a role in the world, folks that whose sole purpose seems to be to critique, to identify errors, and I think in the case of catching like real like fundamental flaws and stuff play a key role. We need those, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of unfair that as a scientific field we force a small group of people to have to police everybody else's work. Ideally, they wouldn't have to do that job. And so there's a lot of value in the people who have developed very honest and high integrity tools to find mistakes.
Yeah, I think some of the AI tools for finding errors, at least in data sets,
right, like the images in a neuroscience study where you can tell that the images have been altered.
Or plots.
Yeah.
Like I remember a few years back, the Reinhard Schoen cases he was like this wonderkind who published, I was like crazy numbers, like 8 or 10 papers in Science and Nature per year. And then I think it was actually similarities in the random, in quotes, noise plots
the error bars
that eventually led to the understanding that like there was data duplication or something. Anyway, I don't remember how it went. Yeah, it's important to correct the literature that way, right? But then there seems to be, at least online, and on social media, there seems to be a kind of a short-term incentive. I have to imagine there's some incentive for people just being really critical. Like I was thinking about this the other day. What kind of mindset would one have to just randomly go put a nasty comment on social media? Like if you just think about it, not about an issue you're particularly vexed by or somebody's stance on, like that makes sense, right? People get aggravated and they're like, yeah. But just think about the mindset there. Like, oh, you've got your life, you have time, and you're gonna go like say mean things, right? Like, it's just, like to me, it's just inconceivable to do that online, like to go and just post that stuff. But clearly, there's some incentive built there, and I don't think this is a new thing. I'm guessing that before we had online culture within medieval societies, and that there were these elements exist within us, and that there must be some reward. They must feel some reward. But it's not generative. It's not building society. When appropriately placed, I guess we're saying it provides a corrective mechanism. But what do you think that's about? And is there any literature on this kind of thing?
Yeah, well, not the exact example of being a total jerk online. I mean, I can't imagine doing that because who has the time? I mean, I have 4
apparently
kids
a lot of
and
people
like coach baseball. I don't know how I'm going to like police other people unless it's relevant to my work. And
Sure.
I think someone's like not having integrity in what they're doing. I'm like, you guys are being sloppy. And I might say that. But what I find compelling is a beautiful new book by Mary Murphy called Cultures of Growth, who was trained at Stanford under Claude Steele. Was also trained by Carol Dweck, just came out a week ago, and is getting tons of great press. And in her work, what she finds is that fixed mindset can be a cultural variable, like a more leadership variable, not just in the mind of the individual. And when that's the culture, then she finds people are more willing to try to make everyone else look like an idiot so that you don't get attacked. That's the summary finding. And there's a kind of deflection strategy that if I trash other people for being idiots, then it'll make other people think twice before they mess with me. And so, but it creates the very toxic culture that they're trying to escape, which is the threat of their own, intelligence being attacked. So it's totally counterproductive. And she uses the example of Microsoft under the Ballmer era where you'd go into meetings and you'd get yelled at if you made any mistake and you weren't allowed to talk, and they would like literally flip over a table and yell at you and people would leave the room crying. There's a lot of accounts of this as a very public information. And one of the things Satya Nadella did when he came in was to change what he said. He said, we have a culture of know-it-alls and we need a culture of learn-it-alls. And has the virtue of ending in the same word, so it's pithy, but I kind of like that idea. And so Mary describes how in this culture of genius, she calls it, you don't just get the hypercriticism, you then, the consequence of that is unethical behavior where you hide mistakes or lie about things because you're worried about being outed as not a genius. So the culture of fearing mistakes gives rise to the kind of unethical hiding type of culture. Now, the layperson could draw a line between that and like the Zune and Bing and other like failed products. I'll leave that to organizational scholars to decide if that's the story. But at least the cautionary tale is like Boeing is another example where Calhoun, when he came in as a CEO, changed the incentive scheme at Boeing to be something called stack ranking, which is where you fire the bottom 10% every 6 months or a year.
Whoa. Within
your group. So if your group might be higher performing on average than some other group, but the bottom 10% of your group are getting fired. Okay. And this goes back to GE. It's a Jack Welch policy. Anyway, so that happened, 2 years ago. And look what's happened in the last 2 years. Now he's out, right? You have all these mistakes where people aren't going and finding the problems. Now, again, I'm not at Boeing. I can't, as a scientist, I can't say that is the cause. But the argument in Mary's book is that when you have organizations like that culture of genius, you hide mistakes and then you have unethical behavior in order to conceal those and then you don't fix them. But in what she calls a culture of growth, you're like willing to examine mistakes because they're not indicative of a sign that they're not indicative of your overall inability to do well. They're like part of the process of growing as a group.
Super interesting. You said Mary Murphy, Cultures of Growth?
Yeah.
Interesting. It seems everybody worked with Carol Dweck. You, Claude Steele, Mary Murphy.
I have a small friendship group.
It's an amazing group.
By that, I mean I have no friends except people I work with.
You've clearly landed in a great group nonetheless. This is very interesting. So people who are hypercritical or spend an enormous amount of time being critical just for being critical's sake are masking. They're cloaking themselves. It's a form of
deflection.
Self-protection. Yeah.
That's the claim, and I think there's some pretty good suggestive evidence of that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if online, like everyone had to put some of their CV in their masthead. It's like it's sort of like, what have you done as you're attacking? Because that would differentiate the people like Elizabeth Bick, for instance, who I think that's her name, who's considered one of the best data evaluation people, right? She runs her Twitter account. She shows errors in papers, and I think the goal there is to offer people the opportunity to not necessarily retract, although in some cases retract, but to alter the papers, write errata and addendums and things that to say
right.
So that's like the appropriate use of critique, right? She's not doing it to cloak anything else, presumably.
Yeah.
As opposed to people that just run around trying to poke holes in everything that they see. It's cynicism, really. It's kind of an like online cynicism.
Well, I think it's easier to be skeptical than it is to like eventually believe in something after being convinced. And so I think there's a default toward, well, I don't believe that. And we get that sometimes with growth mindset. They're like, well, what do you mean a 50-minute intervention has effect? Well, okay, but all the things you're complaining about are things that we addressed in the study. So at some point you have to just say you believe in the process of science or you don't. And I understand if there were initial studies that didn't follow the process of science or left big holes to be addressed. But at some point it's like, well, we did what you asked for, so I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know the growth mindset field has come under a bit of a not attack, but critique. I know this because in researching the solo episode and this one, one always has to be careful about relying on Wikipedia too much because it's the use of editors, legacy editors, and I'll go on record saying that there's a ton of bias even within the legacy editors. I just got my page vandalized even more, but I've sort of given up at this point because things are kludged together out of context. And so I like that if I look at growth mindset on Wikipedia, there's a lot of supportive evidence, and then you can get like 2 paragraphs of critique, right? And so for the uninformed, they don't know how to weigh that, right? Which is why we basically need a new system.
Well, they kind of want to say on one hand, on the other hand,
right?
Then,
and there's no real weighting. We don't know the expertise of these people, where they're gleaning from blogs or whatnot. And look, I think it's a great concept. I think that it's just, to me, at least, it seems that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that growth mindset and related mindsets that we've talked about today have immense value. I think it's also good to have competing opinions in any field. But I think as we're kind of parsing motivation for people that really want to feel their best, do their best, make a contribution to the world, it seems like the default state, the fast food, the junk food, the Slurpee, the Twizzlers, and the Snickers bar. There, I just got myself in more trouble by naming name brands. The junk food is in hiding by critiquing. Because I think maybe there's the man in the arena thing. That it's easy to be a spectator. It's hard to try and do something real.
Yeah, I think that going back to this question of are you willing to reveal your mistakes or not? Mary writes a lot about great exemplars in her book. Jennifer Doudna, who's developed CRISPR, famously has a lab that's hypercritical in the lab, but then the work stands well in public. And it's someone who could have every incentive to just churn out as many papers as possible and for profit, et cetera. But instead, and I've actually interviewed one of the postdocs from that lab, and it's just like an amazing scientific enterprise. I write about this astrophysics lab at Vanderbilt with a guy named Kayvon Stassen, who it's just a legend. As you know, a lot of people would be thrilled to have one Nature paper in their lives, like he had 5 last year, right? But what he does is mentor probably the most diverse group of physicists in all of America. And he developed what are called bridge programs, where students, often graduate students of color or students who had low GRE scores, low socioeconomic status, they're pre-admitted to a master's program in physics at a local HBCU, historically black college university. And then if they do well, then they're pre-admitted to the physics Ph.D. program. And it's a now well-known idea, but the basic concept is, in the old days, you look at just your GRE scores and say, are you smart enough to be a physicist or not? And what he argued was that the coin of the realm for professional physics is publishing professional physics. And if you come into a lab and you can analyze data and write a paper and publish it in a journal, then you're a physicist. So he has people come for 2 years, regardless of your GREs, but as long as you have kind of grit and resilience and a drive, as you're saying, and lets them work in labs. And it turns out about 85% of students end up getting admitted to the PhD program. And then they do well. So the first ever black first author on a Nature paper in physics is his student, right? So like a ridiculously high proportion of racial diversity at NASA are graduates of his program, his laboratory, right? And
his lab is at Vanderbilt?
His lab is at Vanderbilt. It's called the Fisk, Vanderbilt Fisk graduate program.
Interesting.
Bridge program. At any rate, for my book, I interviewed him and I was like, well, that's your admission. So what happens? There's still 5 years when people have to learn to be a physicist. And every day they have a different thing they do. So Monday's a journal club, Tuesday is a coffee. But the lifeblood of the lab is Wednesdays, lab meetings, where you, as a trainee, put up your figures in your paper in Overleaf, which is like a WYSIWYG editor for scientific papers. And everyone critiques your stats, your tables, your figures, your narrative, and everyone's just looking at your work and critiquing it. And these are all top physicists in the lab. And that sounds terrifying. And it kind of is initially. But then by the time they present at the conference, they've heard everything. And they're doing that far before they're spending 3 months doubting themselves, unable to complete the paper, et cetera, et cetera. It's like you just have to do that. You have to face that fear. So it's very demanding, but it's super supportive. So, and they don't pull punches in terms of the critique of the content. But it's never in question whether the comments are coming from a place of believing your potential to be a great physicist. And what I like about that is that you're not like, it doesn't feel good at that time to be critiqued publicly, but it feels necessary, and you kind of know that you will measure up at the end of that process and that it's formative. I think that's fundamentally what a lot of people, I think, misunderstand about what it takes to help someone become better. Is they think either I have to be a monster to critique you or I just have to pull my punches. But like you can be like Stassen's lab and be super demanding and super supportive, and then people grow.
Sounds like the key thing is to make sure that one is gleaning critique from the correct sources. And this is one of the major issues with kind of just open online critique. While attractive because of the lack of barriers, it means that you have to be a selective filter, right? I mean, you can see this in online comments. Some people are very impacted by them. And then other people say, oh yeah, well that's some person in a basement, or that's what have they done? And, but some people just have a thinner skin than others. And, but when you're in a community where clearly everyone cares about the mission, the outcome, the physics, et cetera, then you can put trust in the critique. By the way, I find it really interesting that this lab at Vanderbilt is focused mainly on motivation and drive as the key thing, as opposed to some standardized score metric or something, or prior experience. When I was starting my lab as a junior professor back before it being at Stanford at UC San Diego, a senior colleague of mine said, when picking students, you have to really evaluate many things, right? Ethics, how they do the work, et cetera. But the main thing is just drive. Are they driven?
Yeah.
And yeah, that turned out to be the case.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, it's such a case-by-case decision. Like you don't pick that many students over your career, so you don't get to really learn. But I think I had a colleague when I started who was like, just told me they just sort by GRE right away. And
Just by standardized score.
By standardized test score. I was like, well, I would never do that. He's like, how about this? How about you take all the low GRE students and I take all the high ones and see whose students do better?
Yeah, I feel like standardized tests in some cases are necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah.
That there's this other thing, this like nuance, and coming up with great experimental ideas, or there's just so many examples of people that just weren't good at standardized tests that just kicked ass in their various fields. Yeah. But there is a correlation there typically.
I think my issue, in a perfect world, standardized test scores would be great for equity because there would be people who didn't get great information in high school about where to go to college or started out in the wrong major and eventually figured out don't have great GPAs or didn't go to a great college, but they have tremendous ability and they deserve a shot. And so I think that argument for GREs makes a ton of sense. The problem is that you can just pay to have someone teach you how to take the GRE and your scores can go up a huge percentage. And so the GREs end up being a proxy either for the training you got now, or it's a proxy for how good your 10th grade math teacher was, because it's mostly testing 10th grade geometry. And so again, that's going to be a function of what neighborhood you grew up in and how good your high school teachers were. So what I don't love is, like, I would love test scores if they were about meritocracy and equality of opportunity, but they often end up being just a proxy for kind of advantages you already had. So ultimately, though, for Kayvon, the setting aside the GRE in physics was like a hypothesis. Ultimately, the proof that needed to be in the pudding was, did the students admitted under an alternative means end up producing great physics? And in that case, the answer is absolutely yes. And so for me, it's like, yes, consider it or not for admissions, but what are you doing with the students when they arrive? How are you mentoring and how are you training? And how are you breaking the link between whatever advantages they might have had in the past and the work that they can do in the future if they're driven?
We've been talking a lot about data and other people. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about you.
Sure.
No pressure to share anything you don't want to share, but of all the things you could study, of all the contributions you could make, you decide to focus on this notion of mindsets and essentially trying to figure out how people can be their best for the greatest good of the world. Would be the way I would describe it. Is that just inherent in your wiring, or was there something about your experience coming up that makes you value that in particular, or did you happen to just resonate with Carol and folks and feel like, hey, this would be a great place to place my efforts? Yeah.
Well, that's an impossible question to answer because I have no counterfactual. So a real causal inference person wouldn't allow me. This is a digression, but so my only real precocious skill is that I can do the splits, which sounds like a weird thing to do, but it's my party trick at weddings.
You always could? Or you did gymnastics as a kid?
I did. Okay. But not seriously, not for very long. And one time, another academic, he was like, "You can do the splits? That's super weird." I'm like, "Yes, it is weird." And he was like, "How can you do that?" I was like, "Well, as a kid, I was in gymnastics and then I stretched all the time." And he was like, "That is the dumbest causal story I've ever heard in my life. There's no way that is the single, even the most important cause, right?" And I think about that as like, my whole life I've been posed with this puzzle of why can I do this weird thing? And I had told myself that, and I don't think that's even remotely true. I think this, for whatever reason, it just kind of developed. So I can't fully answer your question about why I got super interested in this work. But I will say that out of college, I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and that's because my college major was something called the Program of Liberal Studies, which is a great books major where you read the great works of history and philosophy and
Amazing.
Stuff. Yeah, and then you read them in order. And there's no lectures allowed. You can't even read the introduction to the book. So you just have to read Hume and pretend like you can understand it, and Kant and stuff like that. And you argue with other 19-year-olds about what it might mean. And I loved it. It was great. I still don't know what Kant was talking about, but I'll figure that out at some point. But then with PLS, the joke is probably law school. which is the answer to the question of what are you going to do with this liberal arts major? And so I thought that's what I'll do. But at the last second, I just had a change of heart. And so I went and taught in a really low-income school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I ended up being the 6 through 8 English teacher, the K through 8 basketball coach. I coached, K through 8 PE coach, and then I coached basketball and ran the book club. And I ran the Cat 5 cables to fix the internet in the attic, And it was great. I worked 100 hours a week. I made $12,000 a year. It was a lot of fun. Had a great time. And at the end of it, I thought, now I'm going to go to law school. And when I was doing my applications, a friend of mine died of cancer. It got sarcoma. It was real quick. It was 6 months.
Sorry.
We all went back to college and were there for a service. And I remember being in the airport, and I picked up Jeffrey Sachs' End of Poverty, which is a popular book at the time. And just thinking here's a guy who I don't know, was doing something pretty mundane, macroeconomics, but he was spending all his time talking world leaders in other countries out of, crushing debt that was causing poverty. And just taking whatever precocious skill he had and using it for others. And I thought, law's not my Jeff Sachs skill. But what I do know how to do is motivate teenagers. That's how I spend all my time. And so I thought I want to do this science of motivating young people as much as possible. So then I went to Stanford. I'd never taken stats before, never taken psychology, but I just tried to become a wild man, learning as much as I could. And thankfully, in my 3rd year, Carol started working with me, and we kind of haven't looked back since.
What an awesome story. So totally mission driven and
post hoc causal inference. So who knows if that's actually the story? But those sequence of events did occur, though.
Post hoc causal inference.
Yeah.
I guess you can map onto that famous Steve Jobs commencement speech at Stanford, where he's basically saying you can't connect the dots going forward, only backward. So it all makes sense looking back.
Exactly.
Right. This led to that, led to this, led to that. But going forward, we're kind of stumbling in the dark a bit. Well, I must say, I and everyone else are so grateful that you made that choice or those choices. Clearly, the work you're doing is having a huge impact. I covered a few of your papers on the solo episode on growth mindset, and you mentioned nature and the fact that most people don't publish there at all, let alone once or twice or several times in their career. You've had an amazing run lately, and you just had this incredible arc of papers in this area of which can be distilled down to, I think, forgive me if this doesn't capture it all, but figuring out how people can be the best version of themselves for their own lives and for the world, right? I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about here. And I love the way you incorporate the neuroscience and the motivation literature, and you're so good at attribution as something that we should all model ourselves around. It's really an incredible literature, and I'm excited to read the book, 10 to 25, genuinely excited. This notion of a mentor mindset and how we can bring out the best in ourselves and others. It's phenomenal that you're doing this work. Please keep going. And I'm speaking on behalf of myself and everyone else when I say, thanks for taking time out of your busy research schedule and teaching schedule to come here and teach millions of people about what you do and what they can do to be their best. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks. Well, we're just getting started, and it was great to be here. I missed baseball practice tonight, so not for me, but for 9-year-olds.
An apology to your 9-year-olds, plural?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, because there are many
coach.
of them on the team.
Yeah.
Okay. This is back in Austin.
Yeah.
Okay. When's their next game?
A couple, 3 or 4 weeks. So we have plenty of time.
Okay.
We're still learning how to throw and hit.
Okay.
We'll get there.
Well, depending on when this episode comes out, you can let me know if they won or lost.
Yeah.
And
doesn't
my
matter.
apologies to
It's about
the
the
team.
process.
That's right. Well, I that game is important. But I can assure you that the information that you've given us today is sure to make a huge difference in people's lives. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me for today's discussion with Dr. David Yeager. To learn more about his research, to find links to his social media accounts, and to learn more about his upcoming book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People, simply go to the links in our show note captions. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. Please also subscribe to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. Please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. If you have questions for me or comments about the podcast or guests or topics that you'd like me to consider for the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comment section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. Not so much on today's episode, but on many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discuss supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like improving sleep, for hormone support, and for focus. To learn more about the supplements discussed on the Huberman Lab podcast, go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S, so that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. If you're not already following me on social media, I am Huberman Lab on all social media platforms. So that's Instagram, X, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And on all those platforms, I discuss science and science-related tools, some of which overlaps with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast, but much of which is distinct from the content of the Huberman Lab podcast. Again, that's Huberman Lab on all social media platforms. If you haven't already subscribed to our Neural Network newsletter, the Neural Network newsletter is a zero-cost monthly newsletter that includes podcast summaries as well as protocols in the form of brief 1 to 3 page PDFs for things like how to optimize your sleep, how to optimize your dopamine, deliberate cold exposure. We have a foundational fitness protocol and a protocol for neuroplasticity and learning and a lot more. All of which, again, is completely zero cost to access. You simply go to Huberman Lab, go to the menu tab, scroll down to newsletter, and provide your email. And we do not share your email with anybody. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion all about growth mindset and the stress can be performance enhancing mindset with Dr. David Yeager. And last, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.